Welcome back to Crime Time, Inc. Today's episode should be a good one for Simon with his interest in football.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
We're diving deep into the FIFA corruption scandal.
Oh, wow.
A story of greed, power, and a sport beloved worldwide.
Yeah.
Think World Cup, billions of dollars, arrests at a luxury hotel.
Yeah, it sounds like a movie.
It's a wild ride. Our guest today is an expert who can help us navigate this complex web of allegations, legal jurisdictions, and organizational structures. So let's start with that scene straight out of a movie.
Yeah.
The arrests at the Borolak Hotel in Zurich during FIFA's 2015 annual meeting.
Right.
Can you set the stage for us?
So picture this. FIFA officials from around the world are gathered for their big yearly meeting, probably expecting the usual, backroom deals and power plays.
Wow.
But this time, Swiss police working with the FBI, they swooped in, arresting several high-ranking officials on charges of racketeering, wire fraud, and money laundering.
Talk about a wake-up call. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of the investigation, let's take our listener back to the beginning. How did FIFA, an organization formed by a group of Europeans in 1904, become this global powerhouse vulnerable to such a scandal?
Well, FIFA's origins were indeed humble.
Right.
A group of Frenchmen, recognizing the growing popularity of football, they created FIFA to standardize the rules and organize those international matches. It's amazing to think that their creation, the World Cup, would evolve from a small invitation-only tournament in 1930 to the most watched sporting event on the planet,
Right.
generating billions of dollars in revenue.
It's almost like a cautionary tale. Success breeds opportunity, and sometimes that opportunity is exploited. To understand how that happened, we need to understand FIFA's structure.
Yeah.
Who are the key players and how is power distributed?
Well, think of it as a pyramid.
Okay.
At the top was the FIFA Congress, where each of the 211 member associations, regardless of size or footballing prowess, got one vote.
Hold on. One vote per member. So a tiny island nation had the same voting power as, say, Brazil or Germany.
Yeah.
That doesn't seem very balanced.
That's precisely the criticism. This
Yeah.
one-member, one-vote system arguably created a system ripe for manipulation. Think about it. Smaller nations with fewer resources and perhaps weaker governance structure might be more susceptible to bribes or pressure from those seeking to influence FIFA's decisions.
And that seems to tie in with what we know about the allegations. Several officials from smaller nations, like Jeffrey Webb from the Cayman Islands, were implicated in this scandal.
Right.
For our listener who might not be familiar, Webb was a vice president of FIFA
Right.
and head of CONCACAF, which governs football in North and Central America and the Caribbean.
Exactly.
So,
Sadly,
here's a prime example of how this structure could be exploited.
he ultimately pleaded guilty to racketeering, wire fraud, and money laundering.
So we've got this potentially flawed system, massive amounts of money flowing through FIFA, and these powerful figures calling the shots. What were the specific accusations leveled against them?
The indictments painted a shocking picture of corruption spanning decades. Wow.
We're talking about allegations of bribes and kickbacks being exchanged for everything from World Cup hosting rights to lucrative broadcasting deals.
Right. There were allegations surrounding the bidding process for the 1998 World Cup in France.
Yep.
Whispers that bribes influenced which nation got to host. Then there were the broadcasting rights for the Gold Cup tournaments.
Yeah.
A pretty big deal for football fans in North and Central America and the Caribbean. The indictment alleged that those rights were essentially sold for kickbacks between 1996 and 2003.
And of course, we can't forget the allegations surrounding the 2010 World Cup in South Africa. Evidence suggests that bribes were paid to secure South Africa as the host nation.
Wow.
This wasn't just about bending the rules. This was about manipulating the very heart of this sport for personal gain.
It's almost dizzying, the scope of these allegations. But how did the FBI, an American agency, end up investigating a global organization like FIFA? It's not like FIFA headquarters are in New York City.
That's where it gets even more interesting. Initially, the FBI's focus was on the bidding for the 2018 and 2022 World Cups. Right.
But as they dug deeper, they discovered that the corruption was far more widespread.
How do they have jurisdiction?
Because, and this is key, much of the alleged criminal activity, like money transfers and backroom deals, took place on U.S. soil. American banks were used, meetings were held in the U.S., and some of the key players, like Chuck Blazer, a former CONCACAF general secretary, were American citizens.
So the FBI was essentially following the money trail, which in this case led right back to their doorstep.
Exactly. And they used a legal principle called the effects doctrine,
Okay.
which essentially allows a country to prosecute crimes that take place outside its borders if those crimes have a substantial effect within that country.
The effects doctrine. Sounds pretty powerful. I bet our listeners are scribbling that down right now.
Yeah.
So we've got the FBI involved, the Swiss authorities conducting raids on FIFA headquarters, and allegations swirling around World Cup bids across multiple continents. This was turning into a full-blown international incident.
Absolutely. And as you might expect, it wasn't long before the geopolitical implications started to surface. Russia, for instance, which was awarded the 2018 World Cup, accused the U.S. of overstepping its bounds and interfering in international affairs.
I bet they were thrilled about the investigation.
Well, they certainly weren't. The investigation raised serious questions about the legitimacy of Russia's bid, which, as you can imagine, they vehemently denied.
Let's not forget the financial implications for everyone involved. We're talking billions of dollars in World Cup revenue, broadcasting deals, and sponsorships. And then there's the economic impact on the countries bidding to host these mega events.
The financial stakes were astronomical. Countries invest heavily in infrastructure and tourism, hoping to reap the economic benefits of hosting a World Cup. The allegations of bribery and corruption cast a dark cloud over the entire process,
Right.
raising questions about whether the system was rigged against certain nations.
It's a real shame because for many countries, especially developing nations, hosting a World Cup can be a transformative event,
Yeah,
bringing in much-needed investment and global attention.
absolutely.
But if the process is tainted by corruption, it undermines the entire spirit of the event. So we've laid out the structure of FIFA, the scope of the allegations, and the international fallout. But was this a case of a few bad apples, or was something more systemic at play?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one that many experts and commentators grappled with as the scandal unfolded. Some argue that FIFA's structure, particularly that one-member, one-vote system, created an environment where corruption could flourish.
It does make you wonder. If smaller nations have the same voting power as larger ones, doesn't it create opportunities for undue influence? Especially when you consider that the indictment revealed allegations of high-ranking officials from those smaller countries being involved in the scheme.
That's a very valid point. And it raises the question of whether FIFA's efforts to promote global development, which are admirable in principle, might have unintentionally created vulnerabilities that were exploited by individuals seeking personal gain.
So we've got this system that some would say is inherently flawed, massive amounts of money at stake, and a culture of secrecy that seemed to permeate the organization. It's a recipe for disaster, isn't it?
It certainly created an environment where unethical behavior could thrive, but let's not forget the human element here. Ultimately, it was individuals who made the choices to engage in corrupt practices.
Right, and that brings us to Chuck Blazer, the former CONENCACAF General Secretary who became a cooperating witness for the FBI.
Blazer's story is fascinating and in many ways tragic. He lived a lavish lifestyle, fueled by the very corruption he was participating in. He had a luxurious apartment in Trump Tower, traveled the world, and even owned a parrot that had its own apartment.
Wait, parrot with its own apartment?
It highlights the excess and extravagance that Blazer's corrupt dealings afforded him.
It sounds like something straight out of a Hollywood movie.
Yeah.
But behind the glitz and glamour, Blazer was betraying the trust of the sport and its fans.
Absolutely, and in the end, he paid a heavy price. He pleaded guilty to racketeering, wire fraud, and money laundering. His reputation was tarnished, his legacy shattered.
That's a cautionary tale for sure.
It is, and it reminds us that even those who seem to have it all can be brought down by their own greed and dishonesty.
It's a sobering thought. So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive so far. We've explored the origins of FIFA, the structure that may have enabled corruption, the specific allegations that rocked the organization, and the key players involved.
We've also touched on the international fallout, the geopolitical tensions, and the massive financial stakes involved.
And we've seen how the choices of individuals like Chuck Blazer can have far-reaching consequences.
But this is just the beginning of the story.
That's right. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll delve into the aftermath of the scandal, the investigations, the trials, the calls for reform, and the lasting impact on the world of football.
We'll examine whether FIFA was able to clean up its act or if the potential for corruption still lingers.
And we'll consider what lessons we can learn from this scandal, not just about the world of sports, but about ethics, accountability, and the power dynamics that shape our world.
I'm looking forward to it.
Me too. So join us for the next part of our deep dive into the FIFA corruption scandal as we uncover the fallout and explore the ongoing efforts to reform the beautiful game.
It's a story you won't want to miss.
And we'll be back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Welcome back. When we left off, we were talking about how the choices of individuals like Chuck Blazer fueled the FIFA corruption scandal.
Right. And while Blazer's story is a cautionary tale, he wasn't the only one caught up in this web of deceit. The FBI investigation, along with investigations by Swiss authorities, led to charges against dozens of FIFA officials.
Yeah, it was a massive undertaking involving multiple jurisdictions and international cooperation.
And it all culminated in a series of high-profile trials that captivated the world.
These trials weren't just about individual wrongdoings. They exposed a culture of systemic corruption within FIFA that had gone unchecked for years.
I remember reading about the trial of Chuck Blazer. He testified against his former colleagues, providing detailed accounts of the bribery schemes and backroom deals that had become commonplace within FIFA.
Blazer's testimony was crucial in securing convictions against several high-ranking FIFA officials.
It must have been quite a sight to see these powerful figures who were once revered in the world of football being held accountable for their actions.
It was a dramatic fall from grace. Some of these individuals had been involved in football administration for decades, and they had amassed significant wealth and influence.
But ultimately, they weren't above the law. So what happened to Sepp Blatter, the president of FIFA, throughout this whole ordeal? Wasn't he considered untouchable?
Blatter's story is almost Shakespearean. Despite the mounting allegations against him and the growing calls for his resignation, he clung to power.
Really?
In fact, he was even re-elected president just days after the initial arrests in 2015.
That's wild. Did he think he could just weather the storm?
It seems that way, but the pressure was immense. Sponsors were threatened to pull out, public outrage was growing, and the evidence against him was mounting. Just a few days after his re-election, Blatter resigned, though he maintained his innocence.
So even the seemingly untouchable Sepp Blatter couldn't escape the consequences.
Exactly. The FIFA Ethics Committee eventually banned him from all football-related activities for 8 years later, reduced to 6. It was a symbolic fall from grace for the man who had ruled over world football for so long.
What a dramatic turn of events. But the scandal wasn't just about individuals. It was about reforming a deeply flawed system.
Yeah.
What steps did FIFA take to address the corruption that had been exposed?
The pressure on FIFA to reform was immense. They faced a crisis of legitimacy, and they knew they had to take decisive action to restore public trust.
So what did they do? Did they actually implement meaningful reforms, or was it just window dressing?
Well, FIFA did implement a number of reforms in the wake of the scandal. They adopted new ethical guidelines, introduced term limits for presidents, and made changes to the bidding process for World Cup tournaments to try to make it more transparent.
Those sound like positive steps, but did they go far enough?
That's a matter of debate. Some critics argue that these reforms were merely cosmetic, designed to appease sponsors and placate public anger without addressing the underlying structural issues that enabled the corruption in the first place.
It's like putting a bandage on a deep wound.
Exactly. For example, while the bidding process for World Cup tournaments was made more transparent, the one-member, one-vote system, which many saw as a root cause of the corruption, remained largely unchanged.
So the smaller nations still held the same voting power as the larger, wealthier footballing nations.
They did, and this raised concerns that the potential for undue influence and backroom deals still existed.
It seems like FIFA was trying to walk a fine line between addressing the concerns of critics and preserving the existing power structure.
It's a delicate balance. FIFA is a global organization with members from all over the world, each with their own interests and priorities. Implementing reforms that satisfy everyone is a daunting task.
It sounds like it. But even with these reforms, the damage had been done. The scandal tarnished FIFA's reputation, and it raised doubts about the integrity of the sport itself.
Absolutely. The scandal left a lasting impact on the world of football. It eroded trust in FIFA's leadership, and it raised questions about whether the beautiful game had become corrupted by greed and power.
And what about the fans? How did they react to all of this?
Many fans were disillusioned and angry. They felt betrayed by the organization that governed the sport they loved.
I can imagine. For many people, football is more than just a game. It's a source of passion, community, and national pride.
Exactly. And the scandal felt like a personal affront to those who had invested so much emotion and energy in the sport.
So where does this leave us? Has FIFA truly learned from its mistakes? Or is the potential for corruption still lurking within the organization?
That's a difficult question to answer. FIFA has undoubtedly taken steps to reform, but whether those steps are sufficient to prevent future scandals remains to be seen.
It's a reminder that reforming a large, complex organization takes time and sustained effort. There are no quick fixes, and the potential for backsliding is always present.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that reform isn't just about changing rules and regulations, it's about creating a culture of ethics and accountability.
It's about changing the mindset of those in power and fostering a sense of responsibility to the sport and its fans.
Absolutely. And that's a much more challenging task than simply rewriting the rulebook.
It sounds like the FIFA corruption scandal, despite all the trials and reforms, has left us with more questions than answers.
In many ways, that's true. The scandal exposed deep-seated problems within FIFA that are not easily solved.
But it also shone a light on the importance of transparency, accountability, and ethical leadership.
And it reminded us that even in the world of sport, where we often seek escape and entertainment, we can't ignore the importance of integrity and fairness.
It's a reminder that corruption can exist anywhere, and it takes vigilance and a commitment to ethical principles to combat it. So where do we go from here?
I think it's important to continue to hold FIFA accountable for its actions. We need to scrutinize the reforms that have been implemented, and we need to push for further changes if necessary.
We also need to be mindful of the potential for corruption in other areas of life, whether it's in business politics or even our personal interactions.
It's a reminder that ethics matter, and that we all have a role to play in creating a more just and equitable world.
But before we get too philosophical, let's bring it back to the FIFA scandal. We've discussed the trials, the reforms, and the lasting impact on the sport. But what about the human cost of this scandal?
That's a crucial aspect of this story that often gets overlooked.
It's easy to get caught up in the legal proceedings and the financial figures, but we shouldn't forget that real people were affected by this.
Absolutely. The individuals who were caught up in the scandal, both those who were charged with crimes and those who lost their jobs and reputations, paid a heavy price.
And what about the fans? Their trust was broken, their passion for the sport tarnished.
You're right. The scandal had a ripple effect that extended far beyond the walls of FIFA headquarters. It impacted the lives of millions of people around the world who love the beautiful game.
It's a reminder that corruption isn't a victimless crime. It has real consequences for real people.
And those consequences can be devastating.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with this thought. The FIFA corruption scandal is a complex story with many layers, and it's one that we're still grappling with today.
It's a story about greed, power, and the abuse of trust.
But it's also a story about accountability reform and the enduring power of the human spirit.
It's a reminder that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges, we can fight for what's right and hold those in power accountable.
And it's a reminder that even in the world of sport, where we often seek escape and entertainment, we must never lose sight of the importance of integrity and fairness.
Well said.
In the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore the ongoing efforts to reform FIFA and what lessons we can learn from this scandal that can help us navigate the complexities of our own lives and the challenges we face in a world where corruption can sometimes seem like the norm.
I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation.
Me too. Now let's take a quick break, and we'll be back with the final part of our deep dive into the FIFA corruption scandal.
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into the FIFA corruption scandal.
It's been quite a journey, exploring the depths of this complex case. We've covered a lot of ground, haven't we? From FIFA's humble beginnings to the arrests that sent shockwaves through the world of football, we've delved into the intricate web of allegations, the geopolitical maneuvering, and the massive financial stakes involved.
And importantly, we've discussed the human cost of this scandal. The individuals whose lives were upended, and the fans whose trust was betrayed.
Right. But amidst all the turmoil and the fallout, there's a glimmer of hope. The FIFA scandal, as shocking and disheartening as it was, forced the organization to confront its flaws and at least attempt to chart a new course.
It's true, the scandal served as a wake-up call, not just for FIFA, but for other international organizations as well. It highlighted the vulnerabilities of global institutions to corruption and the need for robust oversight mechanisms.
So let's focus on those reform efforts. What concrete steps did FIFA take to address the systemic issues that allowed this scandal to happen?
Well, as we touched on earlier, FIFA implemented a series of reforms aimed at increasing transparency and accountability. One of the key changes was the introduction of term limits for the FIFA president.
That makes sense. Limiting the time anyone can hold that much power is a good way to prevent the concentration of influence that we saw with Sepp Blatter.
Exactly. The idea is to prevent any one individual from becoming too entrenched and to encourage a more democratic approach to leadership.
What about the bidding process for World Cup tournaments? Was that overhauled?
Yes. FIFA made changes to try and make the bidding process more transparent and less susceptible to manipulation. They introduced stricter ethical guidelines for bid committees and implemented more robust auditing procedures to track financial flows.
So theoretically, it should be harder for someone to slip a bribe to a FIFA official in exchange for a vote.
In theory, yes. But, of course, the effectiveness of these reforms hinges on their implementation and enforcement.
Right. Rules are only as good as the people who are willing to follow them. What about that controversial one-member, one-vote system? Did FIFA make any changes to address concerns about the voting power of smaller nations?
That's where things get a little trickier. FIFA did discuss potential changes to the voting structure, but ultimately they decided to maintain the one-member, one-vote principle.
So a tiny island nation with a relatively small footballing population still has the same voting power as a footballing giant like Brazil or Germany.
That's right. FIFA argued that this system is essential for ensuring that all member associations have an equal voice regardless of their size or resources.
I can see their point, but it also seems like this system could still be vulnerable to manipulation, as we saw with the allegations that bribes were paid to officials from smaller nations.
That's a valid concern, and it's one that critics of FIFA continue to raise. They argue that a system that weights votes based on factors like population, footballing infrastructure, or financial contributions would be more equitable and less susceptible to corruption.
It sounds like FIFA is trying to find a balance between preserving the principle of equal representation and addressing concerns about undue influence.
Exactly. It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
So even with all these reforms, it seems like the debate about FIFA's governance structure and the potential for corruption is far from over.
It is, and it's likely to continue for years to come.
It's a reminder that reform is an ongoing process, and that vigilance and scrutiny are essential to ensuring that institutions operate ethically and transparently.
Well said. The FIFA scandal exposed deep-seated problems within the organization, problems that cannot be solved overnight.
Right, it's going to take time, sustained effort, and a genuine commitment to change from FIFA's leadership to restore trust and rebuild the organization's reputation.
And it's going to require ongoing pressure from fans, journalists, and other stakeholders to hold FIFA accountable for its actions.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some key takeaways for our listener? What lessons can we learn from the FIFA scandal that can help us navigate a world where corruption is sadly often part of the landscape?
I think one of the most important takeaways is that no institution, no matter how powerful or influential, is immune to corruption.
Right. We saw that even FIFA, an organization that governs the world's most popular sport, was vulnerable to the allure of greed and the abuse of power.
And it's a reminder that we can't take integrity and transparency for granted. We have to constantly demand them, both from the institutions that govern our lives and from the individuals who hold positions of power.
We also learned that sunlight is the best disinfectant. The FIFA scandal was exposed because people were willing to speak out to blow the whistle on wrongdoing and to shine a light on the dark underbelly of the organization.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that we all have a role to play in fighting corruption. We can't simply rely on law enforcement or government agencies to police these institutions. We have to be vigilant, to ask questions, and to hold those in power accountable.
And perhaps most importantly, we need to remember that corruption has real consequences. It's not just about numbers in a spreadsheet or allegations in a courtroom.
It's about real people whose lives are affected, whose trust is betrayed, and whose dreams are shattered.
The FIFA scandal is a cautionary tale, a reminder that even in the pursuit of something as beautiful and inspiring as sport, we can't lose sight of our ethical obligations.
It's a story that underscores the importance of integrity, fairness, and accountability in all aspects of life.
Well said. I think we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've explored the depths of the FIFA corruption scandal, the factors that enabled it, the individuals who were involved, and the ongoing efforts to reform the organization.
It's been a fascinating and at times disheartening journey, but it's also been a reminder that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges, there's always hope for change.
and that we all have a role to play in creating a more just and ethical world.
Absolutely.
Well, that brings our deep dive into the FIFA corruption scandal to a close. I hope our listener found it informative, thought-provoking, and perhaps even a little bit inspiring. Remember, this is just the beginning of the conversation. There's always more to learn, more to discuss, and more to do to ensure that something like this doesn't happen again.
Indeed. The fight against corruption is an ongoing battle, one that requires constant vigilance and a commitment to ethical principles.
As usual, Tom and Simon will review this case and all the others this week in their review on Sunday, but in the meantime, tune in tomorrow for another great true crime episode.